So this is it. We've talked about all of the Oceanic-class liners except for one. The last one built, the steamship Celtic. Like her sisters, unsurprisingly, and like all White Star liners, the Celtic was built at Harland and Wolff in Belfast. She was launched on June 8, 1872, and would engage in her maiden voyage in October of that same year, leaving Liverpool on October 24, 1872. Like all White Star liners serving on the North Atlantic route, she would leave Liverpool, stop off in Queenstown before making her way to New York. This would be the primary route for a majority of her career. When she arrived at New York at the end of her maiden voyage, she was met with a surprising amount of fanfare, with plenty of dignitaries from New York and high-ranking officials of both the White Star Line and the City of New York being invited on board to enjoy a banquet. This banquet was described as being very lavish and was a huge marketing win for the White Star Line, as many of these executives would go on to report to newspapers and other local publications about how lavish and extravagant particularly the ship's first-class dining saloon was, or cabin-class dining saloon, and the sort of accommodations on board, which would ultimately be good PR and good sales marketing for the White Star Line's Oceanic class. It's also worth noting that one of the people that was present for this sort of gathering and would end up taking a later crossing on the ship was the son of Thomas Ismay, the owner of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay, who would later go on to run the line himself and be present for the sinking of the Titanic. Less than a year later, however, the Celtic would find her first little bit of disaster. On a westbound crossing after leaving Queenstown, she struck a piece of floating debris. Now, it's unknown what this floating debris was, but we know that this collision sheared off all 4 of her propeller blades, leaving the ship stranded. Luckily, she was able to be towed by the White Star liner Gaelic back to Queenstown for repairs and to offload her passengers. On June 9th, 1874, the Celtic was anchored outside of New York waiting for dense fog to clear when she was involved in her second incident. She was rammed in the stern by the steamship the Matawan, which did some minor damage, most notably damaging one of her handrails. Now, it's said that none of the passengers were actually aware of this collision, which speaks to how softly this collision was. And while both sides would claim that the other was at fault, there was never any fault prescribed to either captain. However, the crew of the Celtic would claim that they were ringing their bell nearly constantly, and the crew of the ship that rammed them claimed that they never heard a bell at all. On January 24th, 1877, Celtic would get her first taste of being a hero when she rescued the crew of the American schooner the Island Belle. The American government was actually so thankful to the crew of the Celtic for rescuing the crew of the Island Belle that the captain of the Celtic at the time was actually personally thanked by the sitting president of the United States, which was Ulysses S. Grant. In early 1879, the Celtic once again had more propeller troubles when her propeller became detached from its propeller shaft, and the Celtic was forced to make its way into Queenstown under power of sail as opposed to its steam engine. This would become a long-running thing where the Celtic would have propeller issues for most of her career. In February of 1880, a very strange occurrence occurred on board when, while sailing off the coast of Newfoundland bound for New York, a large white owl was discovered on board. This owl was described as being very near to death, having basically collapsed on the ship's deck. The crew actually nursed it back to health, and by the time the ship made its way into New York, the animal was described as very healthy and was likely released shortly thereafter. In March of that same year, Edward J. Smith, who would later go on to captain Titanic and actually would be captain of the Republic, a ship we've already talked about, would serve on the Celtic as his first role as an officer for the White Star Line. He was Celtic's 4th officer starting in March of 1880. In November of 1881, the Celtic would get her second brush with being a hero when she rescued the crew of the brigantine the Alice. In December of 1883, the Celtic would have another brush with drama when her propeller shaft snapped, basically deeming her propeller useless, while on an eastbound crossing towards the United Kingdom. This left the Celtic basically stranded, waiting for winds to be favorable for her to make her way westbound. Now, this is before the telegraph, so there was really no way for the Celtic to sort of let the world know that it was having trouble, so the best she could do was hope that people notice she's overdue and don't count her as a total loss. Luckily for the Celtic, the Hamburg America Line ship, the Gillert, actually passed her and noticed that she was in distress, stopped and offered assistance. However, the Gillert was unable to tow the Celtic. She did offer to take the passengers and mail from on board. The passengers of the Celtic, however, refused to board the lifeboats as the sea state was not necessarily ideal, and as such, the Gillert was just sent on its way. When it arrived in Europe, it told the White Star Line that the Celtic was out there. It was just kind of sitting waiting for the wind to be favorable. A second ship, the Argosy, would also stumble upon the Celtic, and this time a few of the Celtic's passengers did transfer over to the Argosy. And around this time now, White Star Line was dispatching a rescue ship. The steamship Britannic had been sent to rescue the Celtic. When the Britannic arrived at the Celtic's location, they transferred a large store of whiskey and brandy over to the stricken liner before hooking up a tow and towing the Celtic to Queenstown, where she would offload her passengers and then be towed to Liverpool for repairs. And on May 19th of 1887, the Celtic would have a less than graceful brush with the Britannic, when, while steaming off the coast of Sandy Hook, off of New York, she would ram the Britannic. The Celtic's bow was heavily damaged, and the Britannic had a huge gash down her side from the collision and was taking water quickly. In fact, it was thought the Britannic was sinking, and as such, women and children were put on the boats from Britannic and moved over to the Celtic, which was in substantially better condition. However, it was quickly determined that the Britannic would not sink, and both ships limped into New York Harbor, where they would both receive repairs. Both ships were found to have been speeding through the fog, and both captains were declared to be at fault for the collision. In 1892, the Celtic was ultimately deemed too old to continue serving with the White Star Line and was put up for sale. She was purchased by the Thingvalla Line and renamed the America, where she would have a relatively sparse career. She was put on a route that would see her sailing from Copenhagen directly to New York. However, she would only sail that route 8 times. That's right, in between 1892 and 1898, she would only sail 8 sailings, and in 1898, she would be deemed too old for service with the Thingvalla Line and sold for scrap that same year, ending the career of the Celtic. The Celtic ultimately rounds out the Oceanic class. If you'd like to learn more about some of the other ships in the class or some of the technical specifications of the class as a whole, I'll leave a link up here to my playlist all about the Oceanic class, where you can learn the story of her sisters and sort of what made this class so unique. And if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Barbettes and Binnacles, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.